We had some feedback from viewers, and I know we've talked about this before. And I know we visit this at the end of every video, but I'm just wondering, a lot of the content in these videos, it's really rich, it's really new. I think to really understand it, it takes like a lot of repetition and even just hearing little bits at a time and thinking about it. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice for listeners on how to receive and work with this information.
Yeah. I mean, the first step, I think, is just to, again, the idea is you have to have the concepts first, to understand what you're seeing and what you're kind of gathering. So it's just hearing the concepts and allowing them to sink in as deep as you can. The way I've kind of been structuring these talks, and the way I want to keep doing that is to keep coming back and revisiting those same ideas again and again. So it's not like a linear lecture where you have this and this and this and this and this. It's more of a circular kind of phenomenon. So, I think just with repetition and time, that becomes easier. So that's the first step, is just to kind of hear the concepts, hear what's said. And then the next step would be to do what I just spoke about, which is to, now see if you can look at your, let's say, patients or look at a medicinal herb from that perspective. So I think the threefold perspective gives you a little bit more to work with there. But you begin to, effectively what we're doing here again is opening up different sensory organs that are somewhat dormant in most of us. And so just hearing the concept, but then trying to apply it, it starts to open up that organ. And then you have an experience that I found, usually you get to a point that's like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. Now I get it. So it just sometimes has to come at you from many different angles and over time. Now, there's a very important process here, and that is to absorb a concept, and even if you don't understand it, to essentially sleep on it. When you sleep, you are, going into imaginative, inspirative, intuitive consciousness, just not consciously. Now, again, the process of waking up and initiating is to become conscious in that activity. But most of us, when we go into the dream world, are actually using those higher modes of knowing. And, we can say we're being instructed by other intelligences on how to understand them more. So if you are, holding the concept, even if you don't understand it, causes a certain resonance in you, in your astral body. And then when you go into the dream world, now you're going to be able to get more information. It's like, if you don't, let's take an example. If you didn't know anything about physical chemistry and you walk by, you're in a college and a bunch of different lectures going on, you would just walk right by the physical chemistry room and not even know what it was. But if someone now tells you what physical chemistry is, you're like, oh, I don't really understand it. But now you walk by that room and say, oh, that's what physical chemistry is. Now let me go in there. And then you go in there, and that's what you're doing in the dream world. And they're like, okay, well, here's your first textbook. And, and then you begin to learn. So sleeping on it is hugely important. And in fact, I usually, if you pick up any of these readings that we're recommending, it's, something you can do before bed and to then sleep on it. And when you get up in the morning, you'll find that you have often a new understanding. Sometimes that takes more than one night. It may take days or weeks or months before certain knowledge comes out. But I always find the more I do this, the more, we'd say it's your bias now in a certain way to seeing that information, but the more information seems to come to me. So I've had the experience many times where maybe I've read some of these concepts and I'm kind of struggling with them, not really understanding. And then I go to Powell's, for example, like when you could still go to Powell's, and I'd just be browsing and I would just happen to pick up this book and just open it up to the very page where that answer is. And I'm like, oh, that's what it is, And so, let's just say forces become active that guide you through this process if you stay open to it. So that would be my advice.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Motoyuki.
I'm Dr. Kalnins, Paul Kalnins.
And welcome to Enliven Medicine. And yeah, today we're just going to be talking about more holistic ways of viewing the human being. We'll get started.
Yeah, so, if anyone's watched the previous videos, we've kind of explored this idea of how do we gain knowledge in science and medicine about things. And, the interesting philosophical aspect to that is that knowledge really comes from two different things. One is, we might say, data from the world. So you need to observe something, you need to measure something, and so forth. But that can also be data like intersensory data. What am I feeling in my digestive tract, and what kind of emotions am I feeling? So that's what we call a percept or a data point. But that data doesn't make any sense unless you interpret it within a certain framework, a conceptual base. And that's what I referred to in the first talk as the ontology of a science. So we have the data points coming in, and we usually need some method for gathering that data. And then we have a conceptual sphere that allows us to see the patterns in that data and to see what emerges from that. So percept and concept really is what gives us knowledge. The kind of corollary to that is basically that what you think the world is what you're going to see. So if you think the world is made up of a bunch of solid building blocks, if you think that a human being is just material made of matter, that's what you're going to see. If you think the human being is a spiritual being and you think that consciousness is the ground of the world, then you're going to see in those directions. And so one of the problems we have today is that we have our modern scientific viewpoint, which comes from the materialist angle, which thinks that the building block of everything is matter and energy, and that we can take a whole, like a human being or a plant or whatever it is we're studying, and we can break it down into individual pieces and then piece those together to understand the whole. That's the whole reductionism, and then we look at mechanisms for how that fits together. So that's one viewpoint, and it's a very powerful one. That's the viewpoint that essentially we have today in modern biomedicine, and I would say increasingly in like naturopathic medicine, there's more of that sort of viewpoint coming out. And it has its strengths, but it also has a lot of weaknesses. So for a lot of chronic disease, we don't really have great treatments for this. We don't really seem to understand how to approach chronic disease very well. We have an incredibly sophisticated system of medicine, and that way of reductionist thinking really leads to increased specialization. So, as a primary care doctor, I would see the patient, and they maybe needed, or in many cases wanted, a referral to another specialist, cardiologist. But if then they had some digestive issues as well as some cardiac issues, they might see the gastroenterologist and then the dermatologist for the skin rash. So, 3, 4, 5 appointments with different specialists later, and they come back and they're like, well, we didn't really find anything, so now we need to do something else. So it's often this kind of specialty game, and that's really a symptom of reductionism. So that's one end of things, materialism. Philosophically, the opposite to materialism is idealism. And that's basically the idea that the world is not made of matter energy, but that consciousness is the ground of existence. And that the world itself, the physical matter and whatnot, is in some ways an illusion. What in ancient India they call Maya, it's kind of the illusion of the senses, but that the essence of the world is actually not found in the material, it's found in what we might call consciousness or the spiritual element. And in the first little discussion we had, I talked about how our thoughts really are emanating in a way, or they come from that ground. So a thought is not something material, it's something that arises in consciousness. But yet it has its own form, its own existence in a way. So that would be the idealistic worldview. And many of the older kind of shamanic traditions, and still practicing shamanic traditions, really look at that spirit realm as the source of everything. And then the material is, again, a little bit of lesser of a reflection of that. So that's the, you can say, the primary polarity that sort of permeated world philosophy, but also Western philosophy, ever since ancient Greece and before. You know, Plato was very much coming from that idealistic realm. There are archetypes in these different things. And then Aristotle represented more the opposite, which is we got to look at the material manifestations, matter. And so in ancient Greece, there was this interesting division between substance, matter, and form. Form really, you know, matter can take on a number of different forms. So your organs, for example, can have different forms. They're made of relatively similar matter, same carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, so forth. But they take on different forms, shapes. And in the ancient Greek thinking, those forms arise from this realm of consciousness. And that by observing phenomena and having thoughts about it, we are actually reconnecting ourselves with the cosmic forms that inspire the matter. So this kind of polarity between idealism and materialism has always been weaving through Western philosophy, and there's many different subdivisions in between. We can say in the most recent past, we've kind of fallen into the materialistic viewpoint, starting in the mid-1800s especially. You know, the viewpoint is we got to rid physics and chemistry, everything of any sort of spiritual element. There's no soul in matter, there's no spirit in matter. You as a human being are just matter. So that's the one end. The viewpoint I've been sort of arguing that we can get to, which can be very helpful for integration and what we might use to kind of arrive at a more holistic science, would be what I'll maybe call the alchemical worldview. It stands in between those two. It says essentially that there are both. There's the material manifestation, and there's the world of forms, the cosmic archetypes, the spirit world. And that you can actually develop a way of standing between to see how matter is a manifestation of consciousness, and that matter itself can then influence consciousness, back and forth. And so in the alchemical worldview, which really arose in the West, was very predominant around the time of the Renaissance and then up into the 1600s before the scientific revolution. There was sort of this gray zone where chemists weren't as interested in the quantities of things, they were really interested more in the qualities of chemical reactions and how those same qualities could be reflected in the soul. So when you work with gold or with certain metal salts in a test tube, you would also try to experience the inner gold and the inner processes going on in the soul at the same time. So it was a more, again, this sort of phenomenological worldview that I think allows us to combine these two polarities of idealism and materialism this way. I mentioned the German poet Goethe, who lived in the late early 1800s, and Goethe was, in addition to his literary side, he had these scientific writings. He was very concerned that science was moving more and more into that materialistic realm and forgetting about the ideal realm, forgetting about the idea that when we observe nature, we're trying to gather the thoughts of nature, and those thoughts have a reality to them. So one instance of where Goethe applied that was he was very opposed to Newton's idea that white light is composed of colored light. So he thought that Newton, that represented the scientific viewpoint, which is to say we got to take a whole light and break it into pieces, colors, and then recombine them to get the white light. In his kind of artistic, poetic soul, Goethe felt that there was something very wrong with that. And the story goes he borrowed a bunch of prisms from a physicist friend of his, and he was going to start to experiment with light. He wanted to redo all of Newton's experiments, and he was busy with other things, so months went by. Finally, the physicist sent his footmen to collect his prisms, and Goethe had him wait in the lobby of his house, and he grabbed the case, and he just took a prism and looked at the light through the prism, and his secretary apparently said he said at that moment that Newton was wrong. Basically what he observed was that when you just look at white light, you don't see a spectrum of colors. What Goethe realized is that what Newton created was a boundary condition where he had a black screen with a white pinhole and the light came through that. So it's really the combination of light and dark that creates the colors. And so Goethe went on to develop this whole color theory where he argued that light is actually something we can never see. In fact, if you just shine light into the blackness of space, it's just black. It's got to reflect off matter to be seen. So Goethe argued that light fundamentally is a spiritual phenomenon. And that darkness is not just the absence of light, it actually represents the pole of matter. So he talked about absolute light and absolute dark. And when you combine them, you get the colors. So for instance, he argued that the reason the sky is blue is that you're seeing the absolute dark of space through a light-filled medium of the atmosphere. So dark seen through light gives us the blue end of the spectrum. And then when the sun goes down and you see the light through a darker atmosphere, you get the red end of the spectrum. And that when you combine those two, you get green. And you combine the opposite ends, red and violet, you get a color he called magenta. So he's the one that came up with the color wheel that you basically use in art class and whatnot. But for him, he didn't need to analyze light into pieces. For him, what was important was seeing that light was the interplay, or colors were the interplay that arose from light combining with darkness. He called colors the deeds and sufferings of light. So light as if it's a spiritual phenomenon. So this is one example of how a more phenomenological view gives us a bit of a different interpretation of phenomena. Physicists, of course, later kind of dismissed Goethe and like, he was just a poet. He didn't really understand light and optics, and eventually knew about electromagnetic waves and all this. But some modern physicists, like Henri Bortoft, who was a quantum physicist who studied with David Bohm, wrote a whole book on this. And he said, actually, what Goethe was trying to do could answer some fundamental problems in physics if we really took that to heart. And so that's kind of a longer discussion about that. But, that's one idea of kind of combining these two poles of consciousness and matter, and seeing how matter itself really comes about through that interplay. So I think that's the perspective I've always kind of worked with as a physician, and that's kind of inspired me to relook at chemistry, for example, and be like, how is a biochemical process a reflection of we might call a cosmic or supersensory process? How is an organ system the internalization of a cosmic or supersensory process? And how do we develop the ways of perceiving that? And can those holes that we start to observe give us new insight? Or are we just getting some other conceptual system that's going to try to replace what we have? The interesting area we see right now, like in so-called holistic medicine, is like in what's called functional medicine. Functional medicine really is being practiced by not just naturopaths, but a lot of MDs and DOs, nurse practitioners and whatnot. And the idea is, we try to go a little deeper than the typical biomedical approach. So there's a focus on digestion and the microbiome and neurotransmitters and amino acid testing and so forth. And, on one level, it sounds like, well, this is great. This is getting us away from just the drug-based approaches. And it gives us maybe new insight into pathophysiology and whatnot. But the end result of that, I often saw in practice, people who had gone to functional medicine providers, they'd come back with 2 shopping bags full of supplements and all these things. So in a way, it's still piecemeal. It's still, you say, oh, your endothelial dysfunction is causing X, Y, and Z, your hypertension, whatever. So we need to give you these supplements for that. And then here are your supplements for your digestion. And then here are your supplements to support your brain health. And here are your supplements to support your liver. And, in the end, it's like, well, what's doing what? And is that really better than our current approaches in some cases? So I think it probably is better. I mean, there are people who told me that they'd rather take all these supplements than what they were doing before because it really wasn't working. But I think we can do better. And, that to me signifies the need to re-examine what are the true holes in the body. What are these organizing ideas, these organizing forces? If we think of the human being as at least our physical body, as the crystallization of these consciousness forces, what are the organizing holes in our consciousness? And that, I think, gives us a unique opportunity to apply this. So you know, we can look at something like the human skeleton as an example of this. And if we start to, we can use this exercise actually as a good exercise to develop kind of phenomenological thinking. But if you look at the skeleton, you know, it's really, you can create the, if you were to draw a skeleton, you really need only two forms to draw a skeleton. You need circles or rounded curves, and you need lines. I mean, basically, those are the two archetypal shapes of the skeleton. So if you look at the skull, it's rounded. And if you look at what a rounded curve is, essentially it's a line that's been acted upon like by an outside force that's bent it in a way. So we can say where you see rounded curves, it's as if there's some outside forces working in to sculpt it, in a sense. Versus the line is more of a radiating gesture. It sort of signifies coming from a center outward. So the skull, rounded gesture, and then down in our limbs, our arms and our legs, we have the linear gesture. And so those two forms, the rounded and the linear, kind of comprise the whole skeleton. In the head, we have our sensory organs are mostly concentrated, so the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth. And so we're bringing in light, sound, all this kind of, we might call supersensory information to us. Super material information, we can call it. And we register that in a nerve. So the nerves are most concentrated up in the brain and the spinal cord. Of course, we have nerves throughout the body, but you can say the center is here in the head. So that's one end of things. That's where the rounded gesture is most predominant. If you go down into your limbs, like your legs, there you have something interesting. You have, you know, the long bone, the femur and whatnot, and then it's wrapped in muscle. Whereas, you know, if you look at the head, it's like there's the skull, it has muscle around it, but then you have most of the bulk of it, the marrow is like is the brain itself, in a sense. So down in the limbs, we have these linear gestures surrounded by muscle. And unlike nerves, which are more related to, you know, these ineffable thinking processes, taking sensory information, processing and whatnot, you have this sense down in the muscles that's connected very much with metabolism. So, you know, it's working more with matter, with material. So muscles need a lot of glucose, and the liver is tied in with that. Your whole digestive tract has to support that. So in a way, below the diaphragm, where all your metabolic organs are, and out into your limbs, there's a process in physiology which is almost opposite the process you see up in the nervous system. Nerves are very lifeless in a way. They, in many cases, if you damage the nerve, cut the nerve, it will not regenerate. There's some regeneration in the peripheral nervous system, and we do regrow neurons in different parts of the brain, like the hippocampus. But most of the nervous system really comes to its final form by the age of 3. In fact, even at birth, you can say you have the most number of neurons, and then they start to prune with aging. So the kind of image of the process that you see in the nerve activity. And again, we talk about processes, we're going back to what I talked about in the last little discussion, is the etheric body. So our life processes. The life processes in the brain and the nervous system are actually tending towards death. Kind of an interesting phenomena, that as you think and as you use your nerves, you actually create a death state in the body. You use up life energies. You use up glucose, you create waste products, but allows you to think. So we might say that nerves are specialized structures that sacrifice their life energy so they can use it on a higher level for thinking. And that really goes to this more traditional view that the nerves are like mirrors. They have to still their life energy to reflect from the cosmos on this dome of your skull, to reflect all these forces into you, to create our inner thoughts and to create our inner life in this way. Jumping down to your liver or your muscle, there you have burgeoning life activity. You know, skeletal muscle has only limited capacity to regenerate, but you know, your typical, like a liver cell, hepatocyte, has a massive capacity to regenerate, and uses incredible amounts of energy to do this. At the same time, there's not the same kind of reflective consciousness force in a liver cell. So a liver sacrifices the consciousness and strengthens the life activity. So it's an opposite effect. So when you begin to reflect on these kind of relationships, you start to see that there's a polarity, you might say, between your head forces, which concentrate your neurosensory system, and then your metabolic forces below the diaphragm and into your limbs that really focus more on life, regeneration, building up, tearing down and building up of substance in this way. So that's one fundamental polarity, and that's really the polarity between, if you think of the nerve forces more as our connection with that archetypal realm, our heaven realm in a sense, and then our metabolic forces more connected with the earth, with our digestive processes, with reproduction, gives us another physical being in the world. That's more of an earthly phenomenon. So the ultimate combination of heaven and earth is really signified in the human form. What's interesting is if you go back to the skeleton, you see that you have a third region, and that really is in the rib cage. So the rib cage is rounded above like a head, but then it has the individual ribs, the lines. So it combines the rounded with the linear gesture. And it's almost like there's a rhythm between those, the rhythmic distribution of the ribs in a way. Are a sort of merging of the two forces, the head forces and the metabolic forces. So this kind of thinking allows us to begin to perceive, again, more these overarching holistic processes. And so from this, we might say there are three fundamental physiologic processes in the body. There's the process that goes on in the metabolic system of transforming matter, burning energy, making heat, all this kind of thing, but also growing, living. And this is historically, the alchemists looked at this and they refer to that activity as sulfur. Sulfur for them was not just the mineral sulfur, the element sulfur, it was the process of combustion, where matter was taken, burned, energy is released, and then recaptured and used for other things. So that's the sulfur activity. And your organs like your liver and your digestive tract are sort of a center of that activity. At the other end of things, in the nerve sensory system, the process of forming a nerve or forming a thought was likened to crystallization. And they call that salting. So if you imagine, for example, going back to chemistry class, you have this super saturated solution of salt and you let it cool, crystals start to form out. And that's very much how they viewed our thoughts coming. It's like they crystallize out of the cosmic ethers in this way. And, literally we can say that that's how the nervous system sort of forms. It kind of crystallizes into the nerve features. It's very interesting to look at stains of nerve tissue. I mean, they look like crystals. They have this crystalline pattern to it. Versus a liver cell or something looks much more amorphous. It doesn't have that same kind of regularity to it. So salting, this process of crystallization, and sulfur, the process of combustion, matter, energy, conduction. Those are the two polarical forces. The alchemists perceived there to be a third force, which was a balance between the two. And they call that the mercury activity, mercury process. And mercury really goes between salting. And if you ever play with mercury, we don't do that anymore. But I remember as a kid, I used to pour mercury in your hand and you play with it. Now, if you drop a mercury thermometer in your clinic, they have to call in hazmat teams and everything to clean it up. But if you look at mercury, if you have it on a table, it tends to beat up into little balls that look like little heads. And then when you combine it all together, it forms an amalgam. It amalgamates, itself and other metals. And that's the sulfur activity. So we can say it alternates between those two processes. In the phenomenological language, going back to the human body, the mercury process is represented by the rhythms in our breathing and our heartbeat. So in a way, the cardiac rhythm and the breathing rhythm are really the bringing down of neurosensory forces meeting with the sulfur metabolic forces. If you were to draw these as gestures, you could say the nerve sensory forces have a consolidating, constricting element to them. They form the body. And there's some very interesting work now, just recently in embryology, showing that the forms of the organs actually originate from the nerves. The nervous system, in a way, shapes the different, in embryology, embryological developments, the nerves just reach out and they actually shape the different organs into their forms. Versus the sulfur forces have a filling out of the organ, more expansion. So if we think of the contraction forces from the head, that's essentially the same thing one sees when the diaphragm contracts, for example. And then you have an inspiration. You draw in a way, the soul spiritual forces through the lung, as well as air. And then when you breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes. And with exhalation, it's like the metabolic forces kind of rise up a little bit. You breathe in, you become a little bit more conscious. You breathe out, you exhale, you go to sleep a little bit, in a sense. So consciousness forces more connected with the nerves on the breathing in, and then expanding out with the out breath. With the heart, every systole is a contraction. So that's like the nerve forces moving in the systole. And that's actually what happens in the systole cycle, the contraction of the heart. The nerve, the cardiac myocytes, which are like specialized, they're not nerve cells, but they act like nerve cells. They conduct these electrical currents through the heart muscle, and that causes it to contract. And then the diastole phase is really the relaxation of the heart. And that's when those forces stop firing. So in a way, the metabolic forces rush in, the blood rushes into the heart, and most of it's coming from the venous blood from your metabolism. So even in each heartbeat, we have this polarity between the nerve sensory forces and the metabolic forces. Nerve sensory constricting, metabolic relaxing, back and forth this way. And you can start to think about lots of interesting ideas related to things like, what is the rhythm between a normal heart rate and a breathing rate? You know, it should be about 1 to 4 or so. And we can think of with every, breathing rhythm, every breath in a way, we have a descending of the nerve sensory forces, and every heartbeat, we have an upthrowing of the metabolic forces. So they form a rhythm. There's a lot of interesting mysteries. The average, if you think of an average breath of 18 breaths per minute and calculate how many breaths there are in a day, turns out it's 25,970, something like that, which is exactly the length of a Platonic year, the amount of time it takes the sun to go around the zodiac once. So there's an encoding of a cosmic rhythm there as well. So the rhythmic center, the Mercury sphere, sort of balances these two. And this gives important insights. It connects in with, for example, pathology. To talk about cardiac pathology, a lot of cardiac pathologies like arrhythmias and whatnot, many of them that are more functional don't start in the heart at all. They actually begin, for example, with too much thinking processes or a disturbance in your metabolic processes moving upward. And so to look at where we should treat, those disorders, you have to think outside the heart. Of course, with our modern specialists, the cardiologist just looks at this one area right here, and they just see that. They're not thinking about what's going on in the head and metabolism. I mean, good ones will, but that's not typically what's done. But, if you back up, we have to start to say, well, how are these three fundamental forces, these salting processes, sulfuric and mercury, how are they all coming together to create a healthy heart rhythm? So that's one example of how we can maybe start to think more archetypally about the body, and how we can see those activities impressed all the way down into form. So think of those activities as shaping the skeleton, and then we can start to understand why certain body areas have the shapes that they have. It gets more complicated, of course, because we have a nervous system not just in the head, but also in our chest and our thorax, and we have it in our abdomen and our limbs as well. But each has a different function. So we can think of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, is more connected with consciousness, conscious activities, our day-to-day activities. that's a gross oversimplification because we can divide the brain itself into these three regions, and I can come back to that. But then if you go into the chest, you have peripheral nerves, which are your sensory and motor nerves that go out to the muscles and whatnot, that are more related to your voluntary muscular system. So if you want to move your arm, motor impulse has to come down from the brain, goes out to the motor nerve, and so forth. And then conscious sensory information is coming up. But we also have centered in the chest the sympathetic nervous system. We can say that's a little bit, that's not conscious per se, it's more related to our feeling life. So you get very stressed and anxious, your sympathetics fire. And so the sympathetics, the so-called fight or flight response, is sort of the mercury of the nervous system. And then the parasympathetic nervous system and the enteric nervous system, which is the nervous system of the gut, are more related to that metabolic zone and the sulfur processes. And so that is more the digestive unconscious activity that goes on. So that's just kind of running all of our organ functions unconsciously. And that the vagus nerve, which is the main carrier of those parasympathetic impulses, arise from the brainstem, which is part of that unconscious part in our brain. The brain, if you go deeper, is divided into these three regions as well. We have that unconscious metabolic zone, the brainstem. And then we have the limbic system, which is more the feeling brain. And that's connected highly with the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system. And then the outer part of the brain, the cerebral cortex, is where we have conscious thinking and our higher executive activities and whatnot. So there's a threefolding there as well. The face has a threefolding. The forehead is the true, you can say this is the true brain, the nerve sensory region. Then we have the metabolic region, the mouth and the tongue and the jaw, which is moving. The nerve sensory region is very still, but here we have the motion that goes on, which is the same as the motion in your limbs. And then the eyes with the nose in this region is more the rhythmic region. And so again, this kind of starts to tell us things like if you have a skin rash on your face or discoloration in different parts of the face, maybe that's signifying what's going on in some other region of the body, down in your metabolism or in the lungs, for example. So that's where we can see that threefold principles reflected through every body part. 3 fingers, you can say there's a nerve sensory, rhythmic, and then the will finger, that allows you to, do things.
Yeah,
So
show those for listeners, or the main 3 fingers, or
the what now?
the 3, which 3 fingers?
Well, each finger has a threefold division, right?
Oh,
yeah. So each finger is divided threefold. So we can say the tips of the fingers is where you feel. That's more sensory, your feeling thing. And then this part closer to your fist is where the strength, the metabolic strength comes from. And then you have this meat-eating rhythmic portion in the middle, which is more like, you can say, the rhythmic part of your hand, allows for the flexibility and whatnot. So it starts to, you start to see the interconnectedness of the body in a very different way when you start from the whole, look at the polarity, nerve, sense, metabolic, and then look at the third element, the rhythmic element, to come in. And instead of our normal approach, which is to reduce the body into pieces and then piece them back up again. And then you lose those connections. But this way you can hang on to that. So that's I think a very helpful way of seeing the expression on the physical side through the skeleton, through the processes, that would be more the etheric processes, salting, sulfur combustion, mercury. We can also say on the soul life, the astral body, there is a threefolding there as well. And if we ask ourselves, what are the 3 primary inner activities that we do in our soul life? And again, I'm using soul here to represent our inner life and what goes on there. Really, there's 3. We think with our soul, thinking, and that is connected with the nervous system and our nerve activities, especially in the outer portion of the brain, the cerebral cortex. We feel, Now, a lot of people connect feeling, modern neurophysiology connects feeling with the limbic system in the brain. But there's some interesting research. This is actually not a new idea. It originated with William James, the psychologist in the 1800s. He argued that we feel actually with the body, and then the brain registers it in the limbic system. And we now know that these sympathetic fibers, as well as parasympathetic fibers in the body, are not just motor, they have a sensory aspect as well. And they're bringing information about your heart, your lungs, back to the brain. So in the kind of phenomenological view, feeling doesn't begin in the brain. It actually begins in a change in your rhythms of your heart rhythm or your breathing. And then the brain registers that as a feeling. Interesting to think about how our feeling life is connected. Now, the other organs participate in that as well. So that's where in these traditional medicines, you find that organs have a physical aspect and a physiologic aspect, and also a feeling aspect. So we say in Chinese medicine, the heart associated with joy, the lungs with grief, the liver with anger, kidneys with fear, and the spleen with worry. So that was, I think, coming from a way of perceiving that still understood those connections. So we have our thinking, our feeling, which is connected more with the rhythms in our chest. And then the third aspect of our soul life is, we might call it drives or our will. And that is, for most people, largely unconscious. Like why do you really do something? Most people don't know. Like, you got up to go to the bathroom because you thought you had to urinate, but actually it was your bladder that told your brain, hey, I have to urinate now, get up and go. And you're like, oh, I did that. Well, no, your body told you to do that. So those will impulses are centered largely in our metabolic sphere. So in the liver and the kidneys and the intestines, reproductive organs, that's where the will impulses come from. And so in our soul life, there's a threefolding: thinking, feeling, and willing, that are connected with the organs. And so it really shines new light on psychosomatic medicine. It says that it's not just the brain that's the master of everything and kind of guiding the body. It's like a marionette master. It's more that the body and the brain are in intimate communication. And we now know with the gut-brain connection that the gut is talking to the brain, your microbiome is talking to the brain, but that our embodied life, feeling and drives, would not exist without a body. The only thing a brain would really be able to do on its own is to think, but even there it'd be pretty limited, because a lot of our thinking depends on the embodiment of my relationship to space and how I work. For example, in math and physics, we use the Cartesian coordinate plane, that three-dimensional plane. That's really, if you think about it, just an extension of your three dimensions: right, left, front, back, top, bottom. In physics and math, the X, Y, and Z axes it doesn't really matter which one goes which way, as long as you define them. But in our experience, the experience of left and right is very different than the experience of front and back, as well as top to bottom. So we can say that the X, Y, and Z axes within us are not the same. There's a difference. In fact, if I think of the axis left and right, that relates more to my thinking. So thinking is all about bilateral symmetry and bringing planes together. In fact, when you think, a lot of people emphasize that by drawing inward. They kind of go to that center line, and we kind of compare right and left, compare different ideas and find the truth through that. Versus the front back plane is related more to my feeling life. So when you feel someone, you don't put your arms out to the side to think, or you don't go like this when you want to show your love for someone. You embrace them. You narrow that front back plane in a way. Versus when you want to get something done in your will, you're working more in the up-down direction. So you stamp your foot on the ground, or whatever, and or you stamp your hand on the table. That's moving in the up-down direction. So that gives a very different kind of experience there. So those three soul processes are reflected in the three dimensions of the body. differently. So again, very different ways of thinking. If you are just a reductionist and you're coming from the pieces, it's hard to see those relationships. But if you start from the whole and divide down, it becomes a little bit more obvious. One thing I'll say too is in the actual act of fertilization, you know, when you have an egg cell, which is the fundamental rounded gesture, and it's of course a half a cell. It has half the normal number of chromosomes in an egg cell. And then sperm, which is like a line, that also has half the number of chromosomes. When they come together, they form the zygote, the fertilized cell, which is a whole and has the 46 chromosomes. So basically, the rounded gesture and the line come together in the very beginning in the act of fertilization. So this is, again, when we back up and look at embryology, we can start to see these patterns and forms emerge from the very beginning. So that's maybe a little bit of a higher dimension to seeing, you know, the body this way. I'll give one other example, and that's using the same way of observing and looking at plants. With plants, you know, I'll just take, that's a broad description. What's a plant? Let's just start with a perennial. You know, with perennials, you have threefold processes as well. There's, of course, the root process, which goes down into the earth, sensing the earth. You have the stem and leaf and the leaves. And then you have the blossom, usually a blossom and fruiting, you know, seeding and fruiting process. So rooting, stem, leaf, and blossom processes. And an interesting question is, you know, in the roots, you actually see the activity. If you follow the process, it's more that contraction sense. So it's like contracting, drawing things in, sensing what's going on in the earth and maybe through other plants. And we know that plants, of course, communicate with other root systems through mycorrhiza in the soil. And so one can begin to think about the root system is like a giant nervous system under the earth that's connecting. So it's kind of interesting to think about that we have our head and our senses out here in the atmosphere, you know, under the vault of the heavens, gathering all these forces, versus the plant has essentially its head, its nervous system, stuck in the ground. It's listening to the earth and everything that's reflecting into it from the cosmos. At the other end, where the plant is reproducing, metabolizing, in fact, petals are really just leaves that have lost their chlorophyll, and they have mitochondria, so they're using animal respiration and they're creating heat using oxygen and whatnot. That part of the plant releasing aromas and pollen and whatnot, that's the metabolic zone of the plant. So as we have our reproductive organs kind of down towards the earth and we cover them, the plant is sort of waving its genitals at us as we walk by, you know, just sticking up. And if you look at some flowers like orchids, that's very predominant. They look almost like female reproductive organs, you know, in an animal. And then in the leaf, there you have an interesting connection with what we find in our rhythms, in our breathing and our circulation. So you have the circulation of the sap up and down, the xylem and the phloem, and then the rhythmical arrangement of the leaves around the stem has almost like a musical quality to it. And so there's a rhythm. And some plants like motherwort have a very strong arrangement. And that's why there's an interesting parallel there with using motherwort for cardiac arrhythmias. Sort of remind the body of how to, you know, reestablish the rhythms in that way. So the leaf zone is an image in a way of our circulatory and respiratory system, our thorax region. So the same threefold principle applies in the plant as it does in a human being. What's interesting in the leaf is that, of course, the part of the leaf that captures the sunlight is, you know, chlorophyll. And at the center of chlorophyll is magnesium, and it's surrounded by a little porphyrin-like molecule structure around it. And the process, of course, is that, you know, as the plant captures the sunlight, it splits water and releases oxygen. And then it takes those electrons from the water and it uses it to fix carbon into carbohydrates. And then it exhales the carbon dioxide. Well, animals, interestingly, take that oxygen And they use it in the reverse process. So we combine the oxygen with hemoglobin. At the center of hemoglobin is iron, but iron is actually embedded in the same molecular complex as chlorophyll. So if you look at the central molecule in chlorophyll and hemoglobin, they're the same. It's just that magnesium is in the chlorophyll and iron is in the hemoglobin. In fact, we need magnesium to make proper hemoglobin, whereas the plant needs iron to make proper chlorophyll. So we take that oxygen down to our mitochondria, and then we combust carbohydrates from the plants, and we combust those into carbon dioxide and energy. And we exhale the carbon dioxide. So it's a beautiful cycle between the leaf and our own lung system. It's like they're just reciprocating the same activity. One is, in a way, a mirror image of the other. Chlorophyll actually under ultraviolet light fluoresces blood red, versus hemoglobin under ultraviolet light fluoresces sap green. So there, again, is another idea of that image. So in the phenomenological thinking, we try to find these kind of relationships. And you start to see that there is some sense to nature, but it's at a higher level of order than you would have thought if you just studied chemistry or whatever. That these organizing wholes are present throughout the whole. I'll give one final example on the threefolding, and that's in the mineral kingdom. You know, the salts are predominantly in the periodic table. You could say like calcium salts, magnesium salts. Of course, calcium combines with sulfates and phosphates and whatnot. But the cations, are primarily make the salts, and they're on the left side of the periodic table, so sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. And on the right side of the periodic table, you have more of the anions, so things like sulfur and phosphorus and nitrogen and so forth. And then in the middle, you have the transition elements, which are more mercurial. And in the old alchemy language, again, mercury doesn't just represent the metal mercury, it represents the process of metals, which is really more of a breeding process. They mediate in a way between the left and the right sides of the periodic table. A good example of that is iron. It can be in the +2 or +3 states, the reduced or the oxidized states. And so even iron can take on two different states. It breeds in a way, depending on the different environment that it's in and so forth. So yeah, these principles are universal. They're not just found in the human being. So this is an example, again, of that kind of higher order phenomenological thinking. It's what in anthroposophy, Rudolph Steiner called the threefold human being, and the threefold processes in the human being. And it's a foundation for anthroposophic medicine, but again, it's coming from a much older alchemical tradition. Same ideas are in Ayurveda, Pitta, Vata, Kapha. You have the same kind of thinking there. And it's in anthroposophic medicine, it's used as a basis for understanding pathology. And so that's a whole nother talk in itself. But essentially, in a nutshell, if you look at pathology in the human being, it comes in two flavors. You have inflammatory illnesses, which one can liken to an exaggeration of the metabolic forces. So in inflammation, you have literally a dissolving away of a tissue or whatever. But interestingly, like an acute inflammation after an injury, that dissolving away is a good thing. It brings more life activity, regeneration into the tissue. And so that's where we want to, encourage healthy inflammation for proper tissue repair later. So that's one end of things. So inflammation can be thought of as an exaggeration of the metabolic forces, versus the opposite type of pathology is more related to sclerosis or hardening. And we also use the word cirrhosis and so forth with that. So things like atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, or specifically plaque production, but also arterial sclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries and arterioles. Look at things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which is really the falling out of solution of these proteins like tau protein, whatnot, which become tangled up in the nervous system. That's a salting process. So whenever you have a sclerosis or a hardening, you're really salting out minerals from the normal physiologic solutions. Minerals or proteins, deposits are created in the body. And a lot of, so these are a lot of the diseases of aging, a lot of chronic disease. So that's the other pole of things, the sclerosis. So really all pathology falls within those two poles, acute inflammation and sclerosis. We are plagued today not so much by acute inflammatory illnesses like we were 100 years ago, but more by hardening illnesses and especially chronic inflammation. And one can think of chronic inflammation as basically a condition where the acute inflammation doesn't go far enough, and it's trying to, we can say, overcome a hardening, a sclerosis, but it can't quite do it. And so the end result of a lot of chronic inflammation is sclerosis, is fibrosis, and depositing of collagen and whatnot. So in a sense, 100 years ago, we were more suffering from metabolic inflammatory illnesses. Today, we suffer more from nerve sensory sclerotic illnesses. The inflammatory illnesses have more of a heat nature to them. The sclerotic head forces are more cold. So today we're really suffering in our culture from too much cold activity. One can tie in things like viral infections is actually just an agent that promotes sclerotic forces in the body. In fact, the symptoms you get from a viral infection is your body's attempt to heal you of that. And we actually want to encourage those forces to a healthy degree. So that's where you want to, in a cold, encourage the warmth activity, the dissolving activity. If you have a fever, you want to encourage that fever in a healthy way to oppose those forces. And this speaks of terrain at a deeper level. You can, from this way of thinking, you can start to make the argument that, it's not that a cold necessarily is a virus you catch. Now that's gonna be a very controversial thing to talk about, but we have, rhinoviruses, adenoviruses, and whatnot. It's that if you have been, for example, very stressed and thinking, using your nerve sensory forces excessively, you create an inner terrain, which is now going to be very susceptible to that activity. When I would see like people come to the clinic with a cold, there's that old joke, right? That if I give you remedies with the cold, you'll be better in 7 days. Otherwise, if you let it run its course, it'll be better in a week. Like in a way, the symptoms you get from a cold is not the illness. It's basically the metabolic system responding to healing those excessive nerve sclerotic forces. And so that's something we want to encourage in a healthy way. That's maybe a longer discussion on infectious illness, which I think right now is a very appropriate but also very controversial topic. So I think that's just, that gives us a different perspective on this connection between heaven, earth, and human being that's spoken about in Chinese medicine, between spirits, matter and the soul, spirit, soul, body, this threefold way of understanding is incredibly important in understanding physiology, but also pathology, where too much of those formative forces from the nervous system create hardening, sclerosis. Too much inflammatory forces from the metabolic system create too much dissolving, and they have to be balanced in the right way to have health. And so disease is not something that just comes out of the blue, or it's a broken gene or whatever, or a missing gene. It's basically an imbalance between those three forces. If you have those nerve sensory forces work too much into your gut, you won't have proper assimilation and metabolism of your foods. They're going to go right out through you like diarrhea. So you'll have a lot of, and with the nerves comes consciousness. So you'll have a lot of consciousness activity in your gut, which normally shouldn't be there. You shouldn't be aware of your gut in the same way. So now you have pain, you have cramping, you have bloating and diarrhea. And that's very connected with the way those nerve sensory forces are flowing into you. Versus too much metabolic force rising up from your liver towards the head. Now we have a migraine. So a migraine really is not a problem of the head per se. It's a question of now focusing down on that organ to correct its imbalanced activity. So again, all of pathology can be kind of thought of as those two polarities.
Yeah. I guess I'm wondering, I mean, it seems like a lack of one could lead to an excess of the others. So if there's not enough of the thinking forces, then maybe you have a lot of, or maybe not enough coherent thinking, then now you have this excess heat or excess warmth in the metabolic forces. Whereas, you know, if you're too rigid or and this maybe this is a separate question, like where like if you're stuck on a belief, you want to be right or
Right.
something, and then you're not able to let that go, is
Yeah.
that creating more of this sclerotic hardening process?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially like, you know, an OCD or something. You're circling around that, you're salting out that same thought all the time. And you're crystallized. You can't escape from that. So yeah, that same rigidity then now starts to play out in your digestive sphere, in your heart, you know, maybe predisposing you towards certain types of cardiac arrhythmias like AFib, interestingly, but also hypertension and things like that. So yeah, so that would be a descending of those forces, too much of that activity. Versus again, the migraine would be kind of the opposite, where there's a flushing up of metabolic forces into the head. And now you can't think with a migraine. You have to go in the dark room. You don't want any sensory stimuli. You have nausea. All this digestive metabolic activity is very predominant. So there you want to kind of bring those forces down in a way. Yeah. You know, it'll speak, I think this will be a whole talk in itself, but it speaks to, so how do you properly address that? Well, one way would be, you know, well, if you have an excess of one, you tonify the other, or, you know, take off the excess. But the interesting insight from anthroposophic medicine, for example, is that the place of treatment is actually in the middle, is harmonizing the rhythms, the mercury forces. And so instead of treating excess or deficiencies, which kind of displaces the energy one way or the other, you're actually coming to harmonize the two. And that has a much deeper and more lasting healing effect. And I think that really deserves a whole talk. I know you and I have talked about this, and that we can look at these aggressive energies, either through the nerve sensory pole, the metabolic pole, as being what, you know, historically people refer to as demonic forces in a way. And there are different types of forces, and just moving excess or deficiency around just shifts those forces around, but doesn't actually heal them. So if you're just moving the energy through the meridians that way, it's not really transforming it, but coming through the middle point, which on a higher sense we can say is coming through the heart. We're transforming that negative energy into something higher consciousness, higher awareness, higher understanding. And that can be done, again, therapeutically through metals. And that's a whole talk about, you know, which metals to use and how do we compare them and so forth. But the metals hold the promise of holding those middle spaces, the rhythmic forces between the two, the excess and the deficiency. Yeah. So yeah, just like Goethe's color theory, you know, we have absolute light, absolute dark. We can say in the body we have, you know, sclerotic and inflammatory forces, and they both have to be kept in the healthy balance. I mean, the physiologic forces are nerve sensory and inflammation. If they get out of whack, then we have this sclerosis and inflammation. But it's really interesting to then go through a pathology book and look at any organ and see that we can classify all the diseases of that organ into either one of those two. You know? And then again, that can give you some unique insights into treatment. One maybe final piece to connect it back to the plant. You know, I said that the root processes are very much like our nerve sensory processes, the blossoms very much like our metabolic processes, and the leaf stems more like our rhythmic processes in the chest. That gives you an idea about how to create plant remedies. Say that root processes have an affinity for the head and for the nerve sensory system. And so we can direct the activity through the roots into that system. Versus the blossoms, fruits, and seeds all have direct impact on your metabolic system. You know, if you have a lot of metabolic upset, you can drink a cup of chamomile blossoms, and the blossoms really help that. we don't use it often, but you can use chamomile root more for an excess of those metabolic processes going into the head. So to really bring that out of the head forces. And then plants with large leaf processes or very rhythmical leaves or whatnot, we can think about those as potentially respiratory or cardiovascular remedies to work with those rhythmical forces. So that's a little inkling as to how you can use that to start to find patterns in nature and to start maybe seeing a new way of thinking about herbal medicines beyond just the reductionist method, which is like, let's look at the chemicals, and then the traditional method, which is like, just memorize, that's what this herb does. You try to find that relationship. It's a higher level to the doctrine of signatures, or what used to be called the doctrine of signatures.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think from at least certain herbal medicine perspectives, there's this idea that the root plants go with the lower part of the body, and then the flowers or the blossoms go with the upper part of the body. And I remember reading one of Rudolph Steiner's books on nutrition, and he talked about carrots or maybe other root vegetables as well, and he described that it had a higher like salt content, and that was stimulating to the brain. So
like, there's an old folk remedy for pinworms, which is an intestinal issue. And pinworms are really any sort of overgrowth of flora or parasites from this way of thinking would be excess metabolic activity. You'd say the microbiome is really an aspect of your metabolism. And so an overgrowth would be just an excess of that. So what do you want to do in those cases? You want to bring actually more nerve sensory activity into the gut. Well, how do you do that? You puree carrots. So carrots, the roots are kind of like the head process, and you're bringing that now into the gut. And so in a way, you're using a root process to treat the metabolism. But again, you're trying to treat the nerve sensory aspect of metabolism. Just like you can use blossoms up in the head to overcome a excessive sclerotic or salting process. So we can use blossoms to encourage, or like leaves, like ginkgo, to encourage cerebral circulation. We use bilberries, for example, like blueberries, the wild blueberry, bilberry, to improve vision by increasing circulation into the eyes and the retinas and whatnot. So this is, where you have to start to think more fluidly, not just so rigidly, like roots, head, blossoms, metabolism. It's like you can use them in very complex ways. Yeah.
Just kind of understanding what they correspond to, but it's not just, you have to start with these basic divisions, like, okay, roots with the head, and maybe blossoms and flowers with the the metabolic system, but then there's subdivisions within that allow you to get more refined, or even the way you prepare it would make it more towards the nervous system.
Yeah, so different, if you warm or cook a remedy, heat it, it's like a root. If you roast it and whatnot, you're bringing it more towards the metabolic system. You're putting the heat process in there. If you cool something, then you're doing more, you're trying to get to the nerve sensory system. But I think the thing is to understand in whatever pathology you're working with is to see, okay, is this primarily a problem of the nerve sensory pole or the metabolic pole, excess or deficiency? And then how can I find in nature a remedy that is really showing me the same thing? So that's a much deeper, and again, a larger discussion about herbal remedies. But looking at, if you look at medicinal herbs, they actually, as most are perennials, these medicinal herbs really don't balance the root, the leaf, stem, blossom processes. That's ornamental plants often have a nice balance between those three. Medicinal plants are in some ways mutants. They exaggerate one of those poles. So, some have very large root processes and not very impressive blossom processes and leaf processes. Some have very large blossom processes and like hardly any roots. And so we can say they are exaggerating the energies of one of those three activities. And so we can use that plant then to treat in the body that same imbalance of forces. So for instance, if you have, an example that's often given is bryonia, which is, you can only use that in very low dilution. It's quite a toxic plant, but at very, very low doses, bryonia is quite effective for sinusitis, sinus inflammation, headaches where you have, a lot of sensitivity, even meningeal headaches, these different things. So basically inflammation in the membranes, either the dura or the meninges or in the sinus mucosa, bryonia has a role for that historically. If you look at bryonia, it's actually a tuber, has this large sort of tuberous root process below the ground. A tuber, of course, is a stem that's sort of moved downward. It doesn't have a very impressive leaf or blossom process, but you can say it concentrates all its energies in the tuber. So as an image, bryonia is really a picture of a person with a lot of metabolic activity that's moved up to their head, which is exactly sinusitis, migraine, these different things. So bryonia is actually in the plant a picture of the pathology. So that's an interesting way to think about plants, is that each plant out there that has medicinal value is really an image of a potential illness process. And so then the kind of phenomenological eye has to come in and say, okay, what illness am I looking at in this plant? That's usually not how people think about plants. They think about them as healing and all these kind of things, but we can say that the formative activity that the plant sort of harbors is an image of the imbalance of your own forces, of those same three forces in you. And so we can use it then as a remedy that way. So that's one way of working with medicinal herbs, is to learn how to see those pictures.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just to recap and then add another question. There are these mirror images in nature between, or you could look at a pathological process in a human, such as, this excess metabolic activity rising and causing a migraine, and then see that same process reflected in a plant. And then that plant commonly would be used as a remedy for that same disease. And you could even look at the plant and see its structure and see how it even looks like that same disease process. But I wonder, how do we, because there's an idea that, like treats like, but at what point would like, is there also a competing idea that if I give you more of this thing, it's just going to make it worse? Like, how do we, and are there examples of actually, this is the disease process, and what we want to harmonize that is something that's maybe heavier on the bottom, and would that approach work? So
yeah, I mean, I think the first rule is that you can't become stuck too much in rigid concepts. You have to be a little more fluid about that. So there is no, you're gonna have to look at individual cases. It's hard to generalize, because in one person, what is a lot might not be a lot in another person. In other words, in terms of dosage. And I think this is complicated enough that it deserves a whole separate talk. Like, how do natural substances work? How are they healing? But I think, for now, this might open up at least one pathway to understanding that, is understanding the threefold processes, salt, sulfur, mercury, and how they play out in human physiology, as well as our soul life through thinking, feeling, and willing. And then they play out in the plants, and then how we can see it reflected also in pathology through inflammation and sclerosis. So it's a starting point, but that's what I think is really exciting about these ideas, is they're not just one-sided. You can expand it now into all sorts of different areas.
Yeah.
So let's come back maybe and talk about that one. That's a long one.
Yeah, I just checked the time and
Yeah.
clearly we're over. So is there anything more before we close out this episode that you would like to add?
No, it's, there's a lot of literature out there that can be consulted if you want to get more detail on this. Some of the introductory books in anthroposophic medicine are helpful. One book that was recently published, I think it's by Armin Husman, is Form, Life, and Consciousness. And it goes into depth on understanding these threefold processes. Getting into pathology, Matthias Gerke, who's a MD internist in Germany, published a few years ago a book on internal medicine, where he basically looks at all pathology from the sclerosis inflammation perspective, and then talks about how different therapeutic substances can be used to kind of work with that. But that's more detailed, and that's, that gets into the real nuts and bolts of this. Yeah.
But like someone like, let's say you're a Western MD, and obviously maybe not in your scope of practice per se to use certain, maybe it would be like homeopathic remedies. You could still look at these resources and get a totally different understanding.
I think if you really are, there are many people that claim to be holistic out there. If you really want to be holistic and embrace holism, this is looking at the wholes. And these three holistic primary processes are kind of behind it all. And so, if you're interested in that, then I think it would be a valuable area to explore for sure. Yeah.
Great. Well, maybe we can put those links in the comments for interested listeners. I know each of those books is probably a massive journey.
Yeah, these are like that book itself, Form, Life, and Consciousness. I mean, that's a good 2-month read if you do it well.
Like a few hours every day.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to read. These kind of concepts are so new, I think you have to read a little bit and let it sink in, then come back. But again, it's this idea where you're not really just believing this stuff. You try to, just hold it as an open idea. And then you check it against your experience. Does it help me understand things better? Am I able to perceive these patterns? And if it doesn't, then it doesn't. But I think most people, when I've taught these ideas to them, they're like, it opens up new avenues of understanding. And so again, it's not just believing, it's actually, you have to check reality. You have to go and observe, make observations and take that feedback in, and then see how understanding it from this higher perspective gives new insight. So it's a continual dialogue with nature.
Yeah, well, I think that's important for all of us, not every concept, not just these ones, but
of course, yeah.
But especially, ones which people have yet to experience. So.
Right, and that's what makes it more into, I think critics would say it's just pseudoscience still, but it makes it more into just a belief system, or like a religious belief, I heard this and this is the way it is. You say, well, I heard that idea, and maybe will this help me understand my patients, understand physiology, pathology on maybe a deeper level. Maybe it'll show me connections that I couldn't see before. And I've found that to be very true. So I think I would encourage, if there are people still listening here, they want to take this. I think this could be kind of an encouragement to take that further and to really start to apply it in your life.
Yeah. Great. Well, this has been the 3rd episode of Enliven Medicine, and I'm Motoyuki, and this is Dr. Paul Kalnins, and hope to see you next time.
See you next time.
All right. just so we're in it. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Motoyuki here. I'm joined today by Dr. Paul Kalnins. I totally screwed that up. So I'm gonna say Motoyuki here. You can introduce yourself, and then together we'll say welcome to Enlivened Medicine.
Okay.
So good afternoon, everyone. Motoyuki here.
And I'm Dr. Kalnins. Oh, we're supposed to say. All right.
I don't know, that could work. Motoyuki here, and whatever.
Welcome to Enliven Medicine.
To Enliven Medicine.
Okay.
Let's
try that again.
Good afternoon, everyone. Motoyuki here.
And I'm Dr. Paul Kalnins. Welcome to Enliven Medicine.
Hey,
I almost had it.